All right. So for all the weeks up to now, a constant thread, no matter what the title was, is that economy had a lot to do with this. Right? That all of the issues around slavery and had economic implications. This week we dive right into the middle of economy. And it was pretty ugly.
Yeah.
Right? And continues to be really ugly. He makes an extremely powerful case about how we are perpetuating essentially the plantation model as we go forward. So tell me what your first impressions were of all of this.
Well, our founding fathers really didn't have any foresight.
Or not as much as what we wish.
Yeah.
Right?
Pretty much, yeah.
At least part of what this story is about, what this book is trying to say is they made the same types of self-centered economy for me decisions that we continue to make.
Yeah.
Right? And it's not even a complete judgment against them, it's just saying we haven't gotten much better. Right? We learn from them and not through them to become something better. Right?
But let me bring this up because it's difficult. Christianity began in a agrarian empire that was industrializing and did great damage to people. And Christianity grew as a sort of a counter culture to that empire and its power. And yet what's happened is it's turned completely around, and we've blessed the market, the myth of the free market as Christian. And I grew up, both of my parents went to Grove City College in Western Pennsylvania, which was a small conservative college that continues to bless the free market, to idolatrize it. And I guess and I just hold two images. There was an article in the New York Times on Mississippi, poorest state. It still refuses Medicare, and it's cut the income tax. But meanwhile, the rural hospitals, those people who are the most fervent Trump supporters, along with the Blacks and Hispanics and people of color, they're suffering from it, but they still can't see that common because it's torn apart. And then I guess the other is my friend who was once a lawyer, after the Great Recession, he ended up selling cars with a CPA. I mean, all were once people who made six figures and were now selling cars. And he was really upset because one of the people died suddenly of a stroke. And what happened was the same thing happened to him 3 years later. And just that's why I kind of don't like the idea of a white power structure, because it hurts us all, even those people that are somewhere up the ladder. So I know that's a lot, but.
Well, but what you're dealing with is exactly where he started with. Remember the quote that he said, no one wants to say it, no one's proud of it, but this is a capitalist society, a capitalist system, and with capitalist rules. And it's taken as you can't do anything about it.
Because that's the best way of all systems to be. I mean, that's the interpretation that they take, that,
Yeah.
Socialism or communism or any other kind of system is just wrong.
Right. But at the end, he said, he ends the chapter by saying, American capitalism was founded on the lowest road there is. So even if capitalism is right, we're choosing the wrong brand of capitalism, the worst kind of capitalism, rather than the best kind of capitalism. And to be fatalistic and say we can't change any of it has gotten us to where we've continued to perpetuate the worst of us,
Yeah,
rather than the best of what it could be. Because I think capitalism can be good,
Mhm.
it's just we don't practice really good capitalism, and we've proven that over and over again.
well, if you look at the very beginning of the chapter, anything that has to do with protection for workers or fair pay, the United States ranked dead last out of 71 nations with a score of 0.5.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a famous clip from some TV show, and I can't even remember what the TV show is, but it shows Jeff Daniels as some type of authority, and they say something like the best country in the world, and then he begins saying those kinds of statistics. Because we lie to ourselves and say America is the best at everything, and yet there's a lot of things that say we are not. Are we measuring by this? Are we measuring by this? By measuring this? Then we're not. But we tell ourselves that magical, we're the best way of doing capitalism, we're the only democracy, we're the only whatever, instead of being honest with ourselves. And thus working to change ourselves into that better thing that we could be, because we say we already are the best,
Right.
right? And so what incentive do we have to improve, because we already are the best?
And I think that that idea of being the best is tied into the military industrial complex, because we really started pushing that after World War II.
We did.
That, hey, we are here, we're number one on the scene, and, raw us. And I think that particular institution is a lot of what's driven that, and also it keeps us looking at something else.
And can I take that a step further, Deborah? Much of what I see as our current issues began in the 1990s and perpetuated and grew from that time on.
Mhm.
And you know what happened at the beginning of the 1990s that made that happen? We became the one world power. So the Soviet Union died.
Fell apart, yeah.
Fell apart. Suddenly we had no competitors, and so we became the only game in town. So we decided that we were the best, and we began eating each other, essentially. Right?
I would make it 1980.
Well,
And-
there's beginnings that happen there. You're right.
And the reason why is that, I mean, I grew up in the Great Compression, in which the wages on the bottom were growing
Mhm.
faster. The number of billionaire or millionaires at that time was coming down. The top tax rate, even when Kennedy cut it, was still 71% instead of 91% under Eisenhower. And we had Johnson sign the Civil Rights Act, which basically opened up the South. I mean, it provided that change. And yet 15 years later, and again, it blessed by that, the Reagan thing was what I call a politically arranged marriage between the economic fundamentalists and the Christian fundamentalists. The whole thing was blessed by Christianity.
That was the beginning of, in the early part of the 80s, was the beginning of the Kenneth Hagins, Kenneth Copeland,
The
Jerry
moral
Falwell,
majority.
all of
Yes.
us who were really pushing the word of faith and God did not ever intend us to be poor. I mean,
Prosperity gospel.
Yes, the prosperity gospel.
Yep. Yep. And all of that, from my perspective, to say moral majority is not a Christian act, and yet it was turned into a great Christian movement,
Mhm.
or at least semi-Christian, pseudo-Christian movement. To say prosperity is part of Christianity, it has nothing to do with anything that's biblical, and yet again and again it's preached out of our Bible. to say I'm more righteous, so I should have more money is so absolutely ludicrous when you, in the face of things like, give everything, be prepared to give everything to the poor, right? Don't hold on to anything. That's just stupid to me, that we think that we can draw that out of the teachings of Jesus.
And I think that was born out of that 80s, indulgence, how they talk about consumerism increasing, the indulgence that we went into. I mean, everybody and their brother, getting into, I was thinking, he was talking about the car business, and my ex-husband was a car salesman, and, cocaine and all of that, and that was okay. It just helped you do better, so, keep on going.
Yeah. Susan, I didn't tell you hi. Thanks for being here. So, I was really struck by the similarities of much of our history with our current space. Particularly, I was struck by the two sets of numbers right before the Civil War and today in the economic divisions in the United States, the number of people at the top of the pecking order and how much they controlled of our economy versus those at the bottom. And it's not that dissimilar. And I hate that right now where we're at. Ron, you were right that we had a much better distribution, from my point of view, a much healthier distribution when we were younger. But we've increasingly told that story that has taken out the middle class and increasingly said high class, low class. And the figures that he gave pre-Civil War were just that. And is this, one of my big fears is second Civil War. And is that part of what's heralding a second Civil War?
Well, let's talk to the Proud Boys. That's definitely what's coming down the road.
Yeah.
And I'm with you. It scares me in that a lot of people laugh and say that's not. Oh, come on, that's not possible. But I look at how divided we are, and I'm like, I'm not so sure that it's not.
And what will ever help us to heal that? And at least part of what I think he's talking about here, what helps it heal it is a better view of economy. If we continue to say, let the rich get richer and the poor get richer, it's not going to heal some of these other issues. Right? Many of our racial issues are economic at their core. Mm-hmm. That you have to be the underling so that I can be the overseer. Right? That's tough. How do we reverse that trend? Right? Because when we talk about minimum wage, there's all kinds of pushback. Oh, companies will go under. Maybe if the CEO isn't receiving so much, maybe if the top comes down some to meet the bottom coming up some, it'll work better. Oh, then they won't have incentive. How much incentive do you need?
Yeah.
Right? What's enough incentive? And much of our economic answer to that is always one more. Whatever it is, one more. And that's a non-sustainable nor a non-realistic goal to always have one more. Mm-hmm. Can't attain it.
So let me bring up, he made a key point, and it's depressing, but it's reality, and we have to face it. We're going to change. And that is, our problems are built into the structure. And this helped to show how slavery played into what we were told was just a battle between the big states and the small states. But the Senate right now basically has a veto power on almost anything, because even though the 50%, even though the half plus one is what 49% or 51%, it is still represents 41 million more people because of the imbalance of the populations of the states. And the Supreme Court, by the way, in the name of protecting life, has been really protecting corporate power.
Yeah. And I
And
think that's a huge issue. Corporate power versus individual rights is enormous in all of this.
and all the money that went into organizations like the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, all of those so-called Fox, Limbaugh, all that brings in this culture, which keeps people misinformed.
Yeah.
And the one, I mean, but still we're coming to the point where the environment, we can't keep doing what the South did to they kept having to move because they kept ruining the soil. And if they had learned from the natives, they could have done better. And we've got to come to a point where we cannot keep doing what we're doing without massive, in fact, it's happening right here.
And the difficulty, Ron, is of course, if I'm the big plantation owner and I have a smooth running operation from my point of view, then of course I'm better at and should take care of more land than that very small farmer over there who's really not getting full advantage of his land. So why don't I? And that's the rationale that allows us to go and push out these other people, buy up their land, because I'm better at it. And is better at it our goal? It's often been the corporate goal, hasn't it? But is that good for the us economy? Or just good for a slice of?
What's good for the me
Yeah.
economy? Where was the quote? Go on around me, I'll find
All right.
it.
Yeah, and that what's good for us and what's good for me are whole different things. And there's a big narrative that says if the if the me is taken care of, then the us will follow. But that's just trickle down economics by a different name, right? What do we do to purposely say, let's take care of all of us? And part of it is what you were saying earlier, Ron, is how do we put ourselves into an economy that stresses enough more than one more.
Well, and one of the big things is, and it's mentioned in the native tradition, is to take a look at, what's going to be best for the next generation or 7 generations. And right now we have a system that looks at what's best for the quarterly profits every 3 months. And that focus, I do remember the history. They would talk about the panic of 37, the panic of 93. But those panics and the Great Depression, the Great Recession, those all resulted from overreach, and yet we keep
Overreach.
We don't change the system well enough to make a difference, with the exception of it wasn't perfect, but the New Deal did provide some real regulation, ensuring the banknotes, the deposits, all that, which has really helped us. But every time they started to loosen the regulations, we go back to the same thing.
It ushered in, and it wasn't just the New Deal, but it ushered in one of the best times of prosperity in America, right? But in that time of prosperity, in the 1950s, 1960s, is when, like you said, we started taking away those regulations. We started changing into more of a shark environment, if I can say it that way, where eating up others in the name of profit became okay. But how different is that from the plantation owner that says, I can work these slaves as much as I want to in order to get my profit?
Yeah, that, I found that in the chapter, just like, oh my God, when they talked about how much a single slave produced, I think it was like 1801 or something, and then how much they produced just prior to the Civil War, and how they just kept driving and driving and
Yeah.
driving to get more and more out of them.
Yeah, and I think that drawing that out to then say that was the type of model that was used in the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
The assembly line, I only put on this one little widget, that's all I do, and pass it on, and that was more efficient. But is it better for souls? Not just individual souls, but the soul of a country, right? So we get better profits, but at what expense?
And I think as long as we keep the corporate, I'm sorry, Sam.
No, no.
Keep the corporation with this as an individual, it has individual rights. It'll be really difficult to address that soul issue.
Yeah.
Because the corporation is in and of itself its own entity.
Right, and he referred to Citizens United. Probably one of the most important Supreme Court decisions to overturn. It was a horrible decision that decided to equate corporate and with individual rights. And we've been paying a lot of price since
It
then.
was, yeah.
It was a horrible decision.
Well, those are the kind of things that happen all along. I mean, if you look at Dred Scott, and then, I'm not gonna remember the other guy's name, started with an L. Lochner. You know, both of those decisions were based on corporation, not individual rights.
That's right.
And whenever we look that way, what happens is corporations are really milking the price of stuff. But if we think back, you know, I mean, when I was a kid, things lasted forever. And if it broke, you took it somewhere and had it repaired. And, you know, over time, because quality has gone down, we become a disposable society. If it breaks, we throw it away and get a new one, you know? I mean, you know, our coffee maker broke, I went out and got a new one.
Because it's cheaper then,
Trying to repair
right?
We bought a new printer for the home computer because it was cheaper than buying ink. But
Yeah,
we also know it's not gonna last.
right. It's that oh, what's the word? I'm sorry, where we expect things to break up and
Planned obsolescence.
yes, that's exactly it. Yeah, obsolescence.
Yeah.
That is our new frame of mind of how things should work, and it shouldn't be that way. We should be smarter than that, but for some reason we aren't.
One of the things that frustrates me and what I see happening with labor and corporations and the way people work is that companies do put enormous amount of effort into making workers more productive. But and we're being more productive. Workers are producing more and more and more. And yet what that does is it puts people like robots and things. It puts people out of work rather than like shortening work hours. I remember when I was a child at Disneyland, going to Tomorrowland and being told that in the future people would work 25 hours a week. That the 40-hour a week that was established by Roosevelt would become obsolete because we'd become so productive and so efficient that it wouldn't be necessary to work more than 25 hours a week. Well, who's ever going to do that? You know, what you do is you get rid of half your people.
Yeah, and that's the bad part is, rather than saying, okay, here I have these machines now, and so I only need you to work this amount of time and I'll pay you the same salary. We say, I won't pay you anything because I don't need half of you. And so
Right.
get rid of half. And we continue to drive everything by efficiency rather than by worker, by what's best for the worker.
You just keep shoving the profits up to the top.
That's right. He
Right.
makes a very strong case about part of that is because the Labor Party in America never developed. Even the labor unions that we had were divided and never had a united front like they could have had.
Well, it wasn't perfect, but we did have, I think I think at least 35%. And I can remember in college, I worked at Kmart making $1.95, but people were smarter, worked the summer in a factory making $8 to $10 an hour. They just put their mind on hold. And the factory jobs paid well then. Because of the unions, and there was a deliberate attempt to cut unions as part of this process.
Right.
And labor lost its countervailing power.
So why is it that we have so deified profit at the expense of so much so much other that we could have focused on? Why have we decided that profit had such importance to us?
Well, if I can bring up the book Jesus and John Wayne, I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's basically a look at evangelical subculture, and how that the rise of militant masculinity. It's subtitled "How the White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation." But basically, her thesis was that the evangelical subculture basically fed this story, and that if you're immersed in that, that's all you know. And starting with in the 30s, capitalism had a bad connotation, but part of the libertarian right, which moved up into, starting with the father of the Koch brothers, was to build capitalism as a positive. And so in some ways, we've been immersed in a story that tells us that greed is good.
I think it's a long historical thing too, in terms of the United States was formed on the basis of profit. Was not, I mean, it's a freak that we had the American Revolution because things were bad, but they were not bad to the point that generally pushes the public to the point where they will revolt, like the French and some of the others. I mean, we were utterly offended at the French because of all the blood that ran in their streets. And so I think this idea of our founding fathers created that, left for noble gain, financial thing, it's just like embedded. It's just who we came out of. And we love our mythology. And it's very, very difficult to change now.
Yeah.
Well, the one quote in here that struck me is, "It is the culture of acquiring wealth without work, growing at all costs, and abusing the powerless." And that's what our profit culture is based on.
Yeah. So it's really good if I can pay my workers less because that gives me more profit.
Yeah.
But what does that say about the moral majority that I'm trying to say I am? If I'm saying it's right for me to not pay people what they're worth. What's it say?
That you suck.
That I suck. Basically, you're right. And yet we have deified that type of message. That if I can get 43% profit instead of 40%, then I'm better. And it's usually on the backs of workers that happens. And higher up the corporate ladder, salaries soar. And why is that soaring of salaries important instead of the transferring of that down to here?
And that's just what I classify as corporate greed.
Yeah.
I think it's Ben and Jerry's ice cream. that has maintained a salary structure where their highest paid employee makes no more than, oh, and I wish I could remember clearly, 10 or 50% than the lowest paid worker on their line. They turn their profits back into profit sharing. And they say it's like a fabulous company to work for. I hope they are still structured that way, because to me, that was awesome. And I've seen a couple of different places online when I'm, just playing on the internet that do the same thing. People are complaining if the minimum wage goes up to $15 an hour, everything will go up. Well, McDonald's has already raised their prices, in expectation of minimum wage going up.
Yeah.
But there's a hamburger place, and I don't remember where it was, but some other state, not Arizona, where they have not raised their prices since the late 1960s. Their workers all get minimum wage or higher, and you can still get a hamburger for like $2.35, and they're packed all the time.
They figured out how to do that.
Yeah,
The tough part is, well, I mean, Ron, you come from an industry where there's nobody making multiples of the teaching salary, right?
Yes.
Right? That's supposed to be an altruistic industry, right? But principals, superintendents who don't spend but a few moments in the classroom as they're evaluating the teacher suddenly get paid hundreds of thousands of dollars. Are they worth that much more?
no,
Well, let me bring up though, because I mean, we use an economic yardstick called gross domestic product, which takes a look at anything. Making nuclear bombs is the same as making medicine. Women's work in nurturing children is sort of underplayed. Stock sellbacks become part of the procedure. And then there's the concept of externalities, so that if you are, we're paying money to subsidize corn, which is then used to feed cattle and creates problems with global warming. All of that is not factored into the system, but we end up paying those costs of externalities.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the solution is widening our measures. And then again, part of it is looking at, we have gone from a shareholder and stakeholder capitalism to just shareholder. And it has done tremendously bad things. And what's frightening right now is that we are in a place ever since the 73, 74, there's only been 2 times in which wages in the bottom have risen. One was at the end of the Clinton era, and one is right now, simply because there's a shortage of workers. But the real possibility of having a worldwide depression because the radical extremists in the House will refuse to pay the bills that they ran up,
right,
would throw us back into a depression and back into the very real possibility of corporate power, of a very authoritarian power. And what scares me is that there's enough people on backing those extremists that don't care.
What you've reminded me of is something that was talked about at the very end of the chapter, towards the end somewhere, and it said, given the choice between parity with Black people and poverty,
Yeah.
white workers chose poverty.
Yeah.
And it feels like that describes much of what's happening right now, that we are choosing not what's best for us, but that which makes me a little bit better than somebody else.
right.
And that's a crappy way to order our lives,
At least we're owning the libs.
Yeah,
But there's been other targets at the past, but it's the same thing.
whoever it happens to be, we're better than. And we're running we're running it into the ground, but we're better than. And what kind of poor range thinking is that, right? It's not even short range thinking. It's just poor. There's no vision to that at all. Maybe it's that all I have to get to is the next quarterly profit report type of thing.
So, but I will bring up, this is a time also of possibility, because we're facing as a planet some very real changes. And, you know, the right has gone completely bonkers, and I hope this doesn't bother anybody, to the point of where it's become absurd. And do we care so much about drag queen shows at Bookman's than we do children, the number one cause of death in the United States as gun violence? I mean, is there a point where it just becomes so absurd that it's no longer, sort of like Fonzie jumping the shark back in the 70s? It just became so absurd that nobody watched it anymore.
Yeah, and it feels in that type of arena, doesn't it? Like, as soon as this Tennessee shooting happened, you know, the senators from Tennessee put on their, you know, AK pin and showed their Christmas postcards with their family all holding their weapons. And it's like, how is that any kind of rational response to 6 of your voters, your you know, the people that you're in charge of being killed? How do we even fit that into anything but, like you say, the absurd? It's just ridiculous, isn't it? And yet that feels like the space that we're in. So what do we do? Because it's not hard to see the drop off the edge of the end of the cliff. How do we begin making the change? Because he made a really good case for how this is not just a current issue, but that we are repeating the story that has been given to us, a story that's been going on now for several hundred years. And how do we begin changing that narrative, especially in a space where Supreme Court is stacked against making that change, right? Supreme Court is going to uphold things like Citizens United and all of that. How do we, though, have hope that it can change? And how do we begin working in those arenas? What possibilities do you see in that? Where can we make a difference? Because we're not going to change it all tomorrow.
Yeah.
But where do you think we can make some changes? What gives at least some hope to you?
Well, again, the ability to cross, because throughout this book, there have been mentions of, like, the Fusion Party in the early 1870s during Reconstruction, where Black and white got together. There were a few cases in which unions became multiracial, and unfortunately, the majority didn't. But again, it's going to have to be to cross the boundaries, so that you cannot be working on othering the other as a way of motivating grievance. And I say that we need to, I mean, one thing that we can do is to change pro-life into a larger picture. I mean, I consider myself pro-life. I'm not so concerned about when exactly a fetus becomes a person. I'm more concerned about life on Earth, that the life after that fetus is born, when now more children are becoming into the world. At the same time, we want to cut funding to the poor, and we want, and the threat of global climate change is the greatest threat to life on Earth at all. And if we can change that dynamic, because what Nixon did in making abortion an issue. And it gradually became, I mean, it took years before it actually became an issue, but that brought Catholic and evangelical Protestant together to form the coalition that kept the Koch brother agenda in place. And now is the time to take a look at perhaps breaking that apart.
So what you're talking about, Ron, is to put a frame around it, is about changing the narrative.
Yeah.
And there's lots of changing the narratives. There's no doubt that one of the things that this book is trying to do by starting at 1619 instead of 1776 is to try to change the narrative around these issues, to try to tell stories and frame incidences in a way that makes us look differently than what we'd already been taught to do. Much of that means that we have to step away from our point of view, whatever, however it's been given to us, by the privilege that we enjoy, by the non-interference that we enjoy, and step into a space, right? I'm not Hispanic, never have been close to Hispanic, but I've gotten to, through my career, be in a lot of spaces with Hispanics because they've allowed me to be there. On Sunday, I got to stand there with my friend Francisco and Sarai, and I got to be able to say, we met and we became dear friends because, and that's a changing of the narrative where you choose the relationship rather than whatever's easiest. And Francisco had to choose that as well. Our two worlds, you know, he lives down near the airport, that side of town, not a very big house, very old house. And you know, we live up here in the foothills type of thing. And there's a lot of difference between those two and a lot of ways to be able to be separated. And yet our hearts can beat as one, but you have to choose that.
And thank you for choosing to learn Spanish, because that becomes a big part of the process.
Yeah, and it's a good metaphor for all of us. How do we begin to learn the language of someone else? Because oftentimes, just like with my little first, second, third graders, some people were trying to say, you just have to learn English. That's the only thing that's important. And it's not, right? It was more important that we stepped into learning their language, right? And becoming familiar with who they were. And I think white America has consistently said, I don't want to learn a black speak, act, look, you know, I want them to be like me.
But the thing is, they already know what we look like.
Yeah.
And what our culture looks like and how we behave, but we have been so busy trying to make them conform.
That's right.
You know, I work with developmentally disabled adults, and one of the best things that we hear is they were non-compliant. Yay them.
Yeah.
They did not conform. They went against what we expected them to do, and they took control of themselves. You know, you're right. We need to step out of our comfort zone and cross that line and go, let me see what it looks like over here. Tell me.
You know, if I can just interject here, I believe in my lifetime, I've been around a while, I have seen tremendous changes in attitudes toward differences.
Yes.
LGBTQ and Black people and Indigenous people, I've just seen tremendous changes. And
Yeah.
so there's a part of me that, I mean, I can read this text and I can say, okay, I can see these, this history of America and but you know, there's also a part of me that says, wait a minute, you know, things really have changed from the racism that was a part of my life when I was young. And yet there are these groups, you know, American Nazi Party and, you know, Proud Boys and these people who are, but I can't help but believe that is an economic issue, that those factories closing and the fact that those white men can't make the living that they used to be able to do with no education, that now a college degree is required to be a functioning member of society. Otherwise, you're not going to get any of the goodies. And you're expected to work more and more hours. I was talking about that 40-hour work week. I think workers are working more than that. I think they're expected to work 50 hours a week. I think that's been sliding at the bottom. But even in the middle, where I'm a software engineer, and even in the middle, where I was at, which was a good salary and good conditions, good working conditions, I was often had work piled up on me that I would have to work 50, 60 hours a week. And, you had to say, no, I will not do that. And not only that, I have come in and just left at noon, just said, I have done so much this past week. I just told my boss, I'm leaving. I'm taking the rest of the day off. And I could do that without getting fired. But the company expected it. And if there hadn't been a shortage of workers, they would have canned me. It was just that there's not enough people with the skills I had that, you could get. And I didn't know that when I was 20, by the way. And I probably wasn't as skilled when I was 25 either. But anyway, I don't know what my point is. I just think that there's been a lot of changes, and it's where the 1619 project, it's like she's trying to say that like this chapter on the economic system, that the economic system is still tied back to the slavery system, and that is what you said, Jim. What is the answer?
Yeah.
Okay, even if she's right about that, even if that's true, there's a heck of a lot of people changing out there, and attitudes toward transsexuals. That is a huge change I've seen in my lifetime. That there is a feeling that, and toward gay people can get married.
So here's the thing, Tricia, that made the most impact in me. When I first came here to St. Francis, within that first year was when the Supreme Court decision came down, right? And what I was most amazed at was not that the Supreme Court did that, although that was kind of remarkable too. It's that suddenly people who were voicing support for the LGBTQ community went from here to here overnight, like jumped 30 points. Why? Because before that decision, they were under a thing that said, I can't talk about it. I love you. I love my sister or my brother or whoever it is that they knew, but they couldn't be vocal about it. And suddenly that gave them permission to step into a different space. I believe that that's probably true in a lot of these other things, but there's the loud voices of the bullies, the Proud Boys, the Donald Trumps, all of those folks are making a whole lot of people be silent that need to be able to find ways to help them speak. And so that we can move into what's a better space and not stay in the dysfunctional place that we're at.
And I think that's also incumbent upon progressive churches to begin to step into what progressive really means and to walk that life.
Yeah.
And speak out and not back down. And because what I have observed is that there was a really big hoopla around gay because they was cool, they're dinks, they're it was
The in thing.
the in thing. And it was treated like the in thing. And then the churches all kind of backed down because, hey, you got rights now, you can get married. And they didn't keep up with that vocalization and take it to other groups and take it to the transgender.
Yeah.
Nope, we did our part and now we're done.
Yep.
The attitudes of the young people, though, the statistics are just amazing to me. That the people who oppose gay marriage, for example, they're just non-existent in the under certain, so it's not just the progressives is what I'm saying. I'm saying the Republican youth
That's right.
are accepting.
So let's go to a specific instance. Earlier, someone mentioned Bookman's, right? It's supposed to be the drag queen story hour there. And Proud Boys announced that they were gonna come down and it was canceled. I think it's because they hadn't prepared well enough for opposition. So in the last couple of days, I've been dealing with stuff that has brought the Jim, will St. Francis host a drag queen story hour at St. Francis if we want to? And I said, sure, of course we could. And immediately people started saying, but what if? What's the security? What's all of this stuff? And that's because the threat of Proud Boys, for example, is a tactic. It wants you to shut up. They won when Bookman's just closed. I'm not just closed the event, not closed itself, but they won. And I understand why Bookman's did that because they weren't prepared to. But what do we do now? If they want to have an event here at St. Francis, I'll do that. And I know the security problems, the difficulties of it. But you have to do that. But they do have a better idea. What I think is probably a better idea, rather than have a singular event, what if all these churches, and these churches have been in, church leaders have been in conversation with city officials and Bookmans and different folks to say, what do we do next? And this morning they came up with the idea, what if we have a joint event at multiple sites, churches, religious institutions throughout the city that all have a service on the same day at the same hour using the same liturgy. And then Proud Boys can't get to all of them. And it shows that it is much wider spread than just a singular event.
I think that's awesome.
Isn't that a great idea? Because ultimately that's what has to happen. That has to be, it is not just a split. Sometimes the narrative is we're the moral majority. And I don't think they're either moral or a majority. But they scream as if that's true, and we have to tell a different narrative.
Mm-hmm.
We have to set it up and say, no, this is what's true. Bullies always think that they're right. And somehow you have to stand up against the bully without becoming a bully.
Yeah.
Right? Which is easy to do, to go down stumble into the dark side, so to speak. Right?
Yeah, it is hard.
So I'd like to say, I think that's a great idea. And I wanted to respond to Tricia. And, as an amateur programmer, I wish that software code, or rather our policies had evolved like software code has over the past 30, 40 years, because then we would not be having that problem. And working with students at Amphi Middle School, working with students at the Pima Community College, they're used to the diversity. And when I taught a reading improvement where that was often the first class where people would come in and they had to do research projects. And so a number of people would come out as being gay or someone actually came out or just talked about their being sexually abused as a male. And all of this opens up, and if we can hear people's stories, then that fear that hardens people can begin to break.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of it is we need to bring the younger people in, because right now, today's New York Times, the Republicans are after suppressing the votes of college students because they know, instead of changing and opening up, they're trying to stop them from voting. And again, when we bring this up, it might begin to change the dialogue. And finally, I just want to add that the number one predictor of how a county will go is its percentage. So those counties that have the most white and fewest minority are the most likely, or actually when it just starts to change, that's when they start to vote heavily for Trump because they're afraid.
Of what they're going to lose.
Yes.
That goes back to the quote about choosing parity or poverty.
Mhm.
In fear, you say, I gotta be better than someone.
And I don't know if you remember All in the Family, but there was one show where that was a drag queen named Beverly LaSalle, and she was killed because someone attacked her, and Edith lost her faith. And if again, if we can get the humanity of the other, then that can change, because the whole part of the racial division is making somebody less human, making someone less American.
And I think what the point that this author was trying to make, I think he was trying to say that the money, the economics clouds our ability to be able to do that.
Yes.
That person becomes a way to be able to make more money, and so I've got to see him only in this small role instead of see him as the whole person, which will take away some of my profit. And that's challenging for us because we've been taught profit to such an extreme degree, haven't we?
And and this was mentioned in the chapter, the Puritan idea of the blessing of the divine was on how much you made, but there still was you were supposed to still, even if you had wealth, you were supposed to be measured about it, and you were not to be extravagant. And even that part of the Christian mission got distorted into now it's the prosperity gospel, in which the sky's the limit.
And what further clouds that, Ron, is once you start getting used to. So we bought a home in 1949. I mean, it was built in 1949. We bought it. It was typical of every one of the homes on this street. It was one of the first John F. Long homes up in Phoenix, and it was like 1,200 square feet. So in the 1950s, that was a typical middle-class home. Well, that is not a typical middle-class home anymore.
No.
Middle-class home is.
And the typical home had at least 3 to 5 children too.
Yeah.
In those little 1,200 square foot homes.
And so we've gotten used to it, and I'm not saying it's completely wrong, because 1,200 square feet was really good for when Joni and I were there, but when the boys would come for the summer, suddenly that house got a lot smaller. Right? And so I get why we buy bigger houses and things, but then we get to where we think that bigger house is normal for everyone. And there's a whole lot of people that are still living in all those 1,200, 1,400 square foot houses with sometimes larger families than what we have in those great big houses.
There's a lot of people who can't even get.
A lot of people.
Yeah.
They're living in 720 square feet,
Yeah.
650
That's right.
square feet.
Yeah, and so how do we become aware of all that and come into solidarity with those folks and say, what's a fair amount to have? What should we do? How do we help each other to step into those places? Do we see the people on the streets that don't have even 650 square feet?
Yeah, they have a 12 by 12 by 12 refrigerator.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe. And do we feel some kind of solidarity with them and move to address that as part of the whole economy? The difficulty of all these issues is that it has to be more than just you and what's important for you. And so much of America has been built on a very self-centered ideal. And somehow we have to, that to me is at least part of where I'm trying to say, how do we get away from that self-centered into something else?
Well, road out.
But I still say we tell our stories, and I grew up in about 1,200 square foot house right by First Avenue and Roger, And, we had four kids and 2 adults. Good friends of my parents had 7 kids in about the same size. And then when I taught the trailer parks, we have kids who would have 2 families living together because one brought up, and somehow, kids couldn't do their homework because, they just didn't have any place to do it. So we just need to hear people's stories.
Right, right. And try to internalize that some of what's their value, some of what's their message is something that can help me. Because Ron, I had a lot of, in the bigger John F. Long neighborhood, John F. Long built most of West Phoenix, and that's where I taught school. That's where I pastored. And so you're right that many of those 12 and 1400 square foot homes were being populated by a couple of families. And those were my kids. And I didn't understand them when I first started. I thought I did. But they were coming in with a whole different way of viewing life. And so one of my big growing periods was when I realized that I had to stop talking misbehaving Hispanic kids in the same way that I was talking to how I learned to, because if an Anglo kid misbehaves, what we typically say is, look at me when I'm correcting you.
Yeah.
And if you say that to a Hispanic, that Hispanic kid has been taught to look away as a show of respect. And so you're saying, don't be respectful of me, look at me in the eyes, be disdainful of me. And so we actually work against ourselves because of the way we try to force somebody into my space. And so I think you're right, we have to tell those stories, and we have to hear how is it that they're seeing, viewing the world, living in the world differently than whatever fits in my box.
Yeah. And I learned that lesson, it's the same lesson,
Right?
the hard way.
And it does feel like to me that we keep going around and it goes right back to economics, that it's that huge gap between the rich and the poor that's at the heart of the problem, even more so than racism, I would argue.
Yeah, well, I just think that the economics has been the ongoing tool of racism, right? That's why I like the quote about parity or poverty. As long as I can make you less than me, then I'll take all kinds of poverty. And it's like,
Yeah.
let's find a way to lift us all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I get you. I just remember my grandparents were born in the late 1800s, and I on both sides, my mother's side and my father's side, at some point in my childhood, I heard them talk about interracial marriage, and they thought it was an abomination.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like the worst sin that a person could commit. And now we've got, upscale schools where white cheerleaders are dating black boys, and they're just like totally open about it. I mean, it doesn't raise eyebrows anymore. I mean, guess who's coming to dinner? Remember that movie? That was such a shocking movie back in the 60s or 70s, whenever that came out. So, I mean, I can't get away from the fact that I think things are changing, that our prejudices are breaking down, whether you're talking about gay people or transsexuals or Black or indigenous people. They're not holding up, except for that minority group who are Nazis, who are blaming all the troubles of the world on these groups of people that are different than them. And that feels economic. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, and they are a minority, but they're a loud and they are a bully type of crowd. And we have to figure out the question of how to stand up against bullies and say, that's not the way most of us believe here in America. You have to figure out how to stand in a space that says all of us is more important than just you.
And I agree with Deborah. I find it very scary. what she said before, that those groups do make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up when I see them on TV with their tattoos and their guns and the things that they're saying, their ugly things that come out of their mouth. They look like the brown shirts. They remind me of Nazis.
Yep, yep.
And so Jim, I hope that you can get, or we can work together to have those services across Tucson. Because that's there's a town which I got stuck in Montana called Whitefish, Montana, which had been a home of white nationalists. But yet when they exceeded, people got together and did the same thing. They put in gay pride images across the town, and then it became impossible for them to target.
Right.
And if we can do small things like that, can make a big difference.
Yeah, but it has to be a lot of small things like that. It has to be something that says essentially to the moral majority that they've got to re-examine all of what they think they are, right? That there's much more, that they are not the majority, that there's much more of a voice that is the majority, that there's a lot of people that are looking differently than that. And we just got to
Be louder.
We've just got to be louder. The one thing you have to do with the bully, for example, is you have to stand up, but you don't, you have to stand up against them. Not necessarily you have to fight them, but you have to stop letting them have the only voice. Right? And in economics, I think that's what we have to do, is we have to heal with saying this corporate centered economics is not good. We don't want to go back to plantation and slave type of thing. There's a better way of interacting than that. Sorry we haven't quite solved everything. We're really close. Next week we'll figure it out. All right.
My God, next week we're talking politics, come on.
Next,
For those of you who come to eat, remember that we do not have a meal next week, but there will be one on Thursday. That's for we'll do the Monday, Thursday service in there at that point.
And class is still Wednesday night.
Class is still Wednesday, yep. All right, thank you.
chapter 7.
Hello.
Chapter 7, yes.
Yes, all right, thanks.
See you
Thank you.
next Wednesday.
Bye, Tricia. Deborah, bye.
Good night.
Night.